Good morning everyone, what's going on? Garrett here. In this video, we're going to be going over the next section of the React documentation, which is section 5 of the main concepts, main section I guess you could say. But basically we're going to be going over state and lifecycle, so let's get started. So if you guys remember, in I believe it was section 3, rendering elements, we made this clock here that kind of updates itself every second, and the way that it does that is right here. Essentially we have this function inside of the index.js file, which is display the time, and then inside of display the time we create this element inside of a const variable, and it basically just, that element just has the time inside of it, and then we run the method to render that element, and then we actually run that function right here. We run it once per second, and that's how we render a new time to the DOM every second. However, that's not really what we want to do. We don't want to actually totally do a re-render of the React DOM every time we want to update something. I mean, it works, but it's like behind the scenes. Like, we don't want to be rendering the overall parent or overall like root level DOM re-rendering. We just want to re-render individual components within our component tree as opposed to the entire thing every time. And we certainly don't want to do it by calling a function every second. That would get really unpredictable, and we just really be able to do that and maintain it inside of a large application. We wouldn't be able to re-render the entire thing, right? We just want individual components to be re-rendered. So what we can do is we're going to change this to be a stateful component, as well as add some lifecycle to it. One of the problems that we have right now is that they're kind of connected. So one thing that we could do, sorry, the air conditioning is on in the background, so it probably gets louder, quiet, depending on that. But one thing that we can do is we can create this clock component, or this clock function rather, and we can simply return, we'll also take in props here, and we can simply return our element. Nope, hit the wrong thing. We can simply return this like so, right? And then we could kind of just do this, and this would give us the same, should give us, the same thing right there, right? But there's still a problem that, this isn't really totally independent of this. They kind of go together, and we want them to totally be independent. We want the clock to be a component somewhere else in our application, not even in our application, just a component in itself that we can just call in various places in our application, and also not have to call this set interval thing for the overall root level render of the DOM, right? So while that's better, it's not exactly what we want. So one thing that we can do, or I'm going to do, is I'm going to create a new file here, and this is essentially going to be our clock component, right? So we'll do import React from React, instead of a function, we will have a class, and we'll call this class extends react.component, and then just so that I don't forget it, we will have export default clock, and it should also be spelled the same way. And then inside here we will have a render, and inside of that render is where we will put this here, this return statement. So we'll put that in there. We can now get rid of this, and also where it was props, we don't actually have any props. So what we can do then is say this dot props dot date dot, well, for right now we can leave it there because we're not actually passing any props in, so that's fine. And then for right now we will leave that like so. We also need to, I'm just trying to set this up more so like a real application, so we'll change this to app, uncomment that out. I don't know if you guys had commented that out. I did it in a previous video. And then inside of the app component, what we can do is we will, actually, you know what? No, forget about the app component. Sorry, we will just change this to clock, but of course we'll have to spell it correctly. And we can change this to be like that. App is not defined, that's okay. Whoops, we have this, and then we can say also date will equal new date, like that, and then inside of here we can get rid of this. Inside here we should be able to change this now to to local time string. Let's see how that goes. It still does work because, where is it? Here we're doing this. So if we were to get rid of this, it would still work. We would just have this one thing here and it wouldn't change. Okay. Now let's look and see how we can add some state to this component, as well as eventually make the time update. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add some state to this, and we're also going to remove the props. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to take away this inside of here. We don't actually need that prop because we're going to be using state, which is data within the component itself, as opposed to a prop, which is data that's passed in from outside of the component. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to add, actually first we're going to come down here and change this dot props to this dot state. Okay. Next, we're going to change this to be, or not change it, we're going to add this to be a constructor, which will take in props. However, we're not actually going to use those props, but it does take them in. And it's also important to note that you should always, if you're making a class component like this, it should always take in props. No matter what, even if I guess you don't really use them, it should always take in props, and that is per the documentation here saying class components should always call the base constructor with props. The base constructor with props. Okay? So that's this, the base constructor, and we're calling it with props with super. Okay? The next thing is that we will add state. And like I said, state is just the internal data for that component. Okay? And we will set the date to equal new date, and just that's it. Just new date. And so that goes to here. So this dot state, the air is going on again, so it might get a little bit louder. This dot state, and then the date. So it should, it's not going to be updating, but it should still work, minus the updating part. And that's because we are just calling the function again. So the reason that this doesn't update when we have state is because these props, they're going in from this parent controller. So the actual data lives in the parent controller, which means that every time we call it, the parent controller has a new date or new set of data to pass into the child component, right? I said controller, I meant component. Coming from the Angular world, it is a controller. So it passes in new data because the data lives in the parent component. And that means the child component, every time the parent component re-renders it, it gets that new data, which makes it look like it's updating. So here, the reason it doesn't is because the data all lives inside of here. And so yeah, it updates if I hit refresh, but the browser itself, React itself, is not updating it, right? Okay. So we have our state here. Let's now add 2 lifecycle hooks. And the reason that we're going to add 2 lifecycle hooks instead of just 1 is because it's important, obviously we want to do something when the component is there, right? So when the component first gets onto the DOM, we want to do something, right? It's also important, though, in terms of performance, to make sure that when a component is no longer there, we kind of stop all the processes and all of the things that are taking up resources that we had been doing inside of that component. So to do that, what we will do is we will say component did mount. Component did mount means that the component successfully is now on the browser, and we can start doing whatever we want to do with it. The next one that we're going to do is component will unmount, and that basically is when the component is going to be destroyed. We want to do these things, and those things usually are going to be freeing up resources from the processor, from the browser, so that we can maintain performance, as well as perhaps, not sure about this, just me kind of guessing, as well as maybe save some data to the database or something if it is going to be destroyed or something like that. So what we will do inside of component did mount, we will set up a timer. So we will do timer. I'm just going to call it timer. The documentation calls it something different. I'm just going to do timer. And we will say set interval. And this takes in, not that. Whoops. This takes in a callback function, which I can do as this dot tick, which doesn't exist, but it will. This dot tick, and every 1,000 seconds. So what's going on here is that we're setting up a timer, and we're using this instead of, for example, those things really annoy me. If anyone knows how to make that stop, please do. Instead of using this or let or something like that, we're using this, and that is so it is set up inside of the actual component, I believe. So it says, while this.props is set up by React itself and this.state has a special meaning, you are free to add additional fields to the class manually if you need to store something that doesn't participate in the data flow, like a timer, for example. So I'm not sure if using let or something like that would work as well. The documentation used this, and they say that I guess it's adding it to the class instead of just, I think this has to do with how the this keyword works. So I think this just adds it to the class versus let, which maybe just makes it a general thing. I'm not totally sure, but I'll have to do more research then and then get back on that one. Yeah, so we're basically setting an interval inside of here, right? Where every 1,000 seconds, we're just calling this tick method that doesn't actually exist yet. We are going to add it, but inside of the component will unmount. What we're going to do is we're going to say clear interval, which is going to clear the resources that we had just taken up with that set interval thing. It's going to clear timer. Okay, and now we can add our tick method, and this will be what actually sets the state. So we will have this dot set state, which updates the state. I believe we went over this. If not, we're actually going to be going over it in more detail later in the video. So this dot set state, and then we can set date to equal whatever the new date is right now. And so this, as you can see, now works back to how it was before. Okay, let's dive in a little bit deeper and see kind of what's going on here exactly. So just to really quickly, before we actually do dive deeper, I want to go over really quickly what exactly we're doing here, because it is pretty different than what we had done in the previous video, which I think was a little bit more straightforward. This is more React-y, you know? So basically when the component is, ooh, air conditioning's off, I'm loud now. When the component's first created, what we're doing is excuse me, when the component's first created, we're creating this state, right? Basically the data that the component has in it right now. And we're setting the date equal to whatever the current date is right now. And then we're saying that inside the JSX, we're saying this time will equal whatever the state is, whatever the date is inside of the state. And it's unfortunate that they rhyme, but either way. And we're just getting the two local time string. Locale? Yeah, locale time string, I think. That's how you pronounce that. And then what we're doing is we're saying when the component mounts, so when the component is there, when it's done rendering, right? Run this function that will basically update the time every 1 second. And that function is right here. Okay, so we're just going to be updating the time right there with setState. And then when the component is ready to be unmounted, when we're going to be deleting it, if you're coming from Angular, this is the equivalent to ng on destroy. Just clear that interval and get rid of it, right? So not too complicated. We're just updating state basically every 1 second. Now what we want to do is talk about some state stuff because it's kind of an interesting concept and there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. So the first things first is this state method right here. Okay, this set state and then we pass in the object. Now there's another way to do this and I'll show you how, but what I want to talk about is that this is the correct way to do it. However, you might be tempted at some point to say this dot state dot date equals new date. And we can take a look and see if this works. It might, right? It does work. However, we get this warning. Line 21, that's right here where we just created that. And it says, do not mutate state directly, use set state. And the reason for this, is that we only want to use this dot state inside of the constructor. Okay? That's how we initially set whatever state is. But outside of that, whenever we're going to update state, once it's already been set, we want to use this set state method, and the reason is because state is asynchronous, or it can be asynchronous, which means that if you do this dot state dot date and update it that way, it might not actually equal what you think it's going to equal when you're updating it. It might have been changed somewhere else in your application, so it can be kind of very unpredictable. So you want to do this because this is having React, kind of go itself and update state and kind of do it for you and make sure that things are working the way they're supposed to be working. Something else that you don't want to do is you don't want to rely on the state value. So in the same way that you don't want to update state itself, you don't want to rely on the state value. So what we definitely wouldn't want to do is, let's say that we weren't going to update the state for really quickly. What we don't want to do is, let's say that we had a number in here that was 0. And so we wanted to say this dot state dot number plus 1. And then down here, just so we can see if something's happening, actually here, we can change this and say number is this dot state dot number. Okay, we get 0. It's like a stopwatch, right? It does update, but what we're doing is we are using the number itself. So we're using state itself to update the number. We don't want to do that because, again, state might not equal that, right? So if I had like a button, for example, and it said add 5, and then inside here, let's add an on click event and say this dot handle add 1, and then we will just bind to that real quick. We'll say this dot handle add 1, equals this dot handle add one dot bind dot this. Yes, I'm aware you can do it other ways, but I'm just kind of accustomed to doing it that way. And then if I say handle add one, and I have this dot set state dot no dot, just dot set state, and then I say number equals this dot state dot number plus 5, let's say, for example. Right, this is going to become kind of unpredictable because I've added this. So I'm adding 5 every time, and sure, it's working. I mean, technically it's working, right? We can add 5, and then this still just adds 1 every time, but when we call this, wait, what is this one? Yeah. When we call this set state here, it doesn't, we think it equals whatever the state just was plus 1, like that 1, 2, 3, you know what I mean? That iteration of 1, but it doesn't. It equals something totally different. And so even though the code-wise it works fine, it doesn't give us any errors. There's nothing unpredictable about it. I mean, to React, it's just taking in what state currently equals and just adding another one, right? There's not so much unpredictableness about that. But to us, the user, it's unpredictable. And to the developer, we can't really code because let's say we were depending on that value. Let's say that we weren't, adding a number every 1 second. We just did that so that you could see something. But if we had, that one, if we were adding a number up for something that was going on, let's say like a subscriber count or a follower count or a likes count, right? It would be unpredictable. And so to the user, you'd be seeing something and you'd be wondering, well, why doesn't that work? That's not the right number. It should have been 1 plus 5. So it should have been 6, not 11, because we just had that button that adds 5. You know what I mean? So we can get rid of this. We can actually just go back through all of this stuff. Let's see. And actually, we'll keep that right here. We'll keep this. What we can do now instead, first off, we can go and set the date again to equal new date. And what we can do here instead, right, if we need the current value of state, we can do that. Because set state actually does not just take an object like what we have here, it also takes a function, and inside of that function we can have the previous state as well as any props that might be passed to the state. And inside here, we'll do this. Inside here is where we could do these things. So for example, we can say pre-state dot number. What's the issue here? Oh. It still needs the arrow bit, and then this is actually like that. Okay, I just forgot some parentheses and whatnot, but either way, so we have this, and so this will work, and in the example that I had with the button, it would still result in the same thing. However, there wouldn't be any unpredictableness because we're able to get the previous state, not the current state. We want the previous state as well as the new, and then calculate the new value. Not what the state is currently, because again, it could have changed from somewhere totally different in our app, especially if we're doing this in a parent component maybe, where state could be changing quite often. Something else that I wanted to note, and this is something actually that I don't believe the documentation has. However, I needed this, and I thought it was very interesting. So we'll just say, we can just do, actually, you know what? Hold on. We can get rid of this. There is also a second argument here, which is in fact a callback function. So what you could do is you could then say console log this dot state if you needed to, for example, get the date. You could do this if you needed to see how something kind of, you know, I can also add state there. If you needed to see how something kind of resulted, you wanted a callback function to get whatever this set state added or whatever it calculated, you wanted to get that new set state, you could do that here. Okay? Make it a little bit easier. We can actually just say state. Just like that. Whoops. And so now this updates every time. You can see this number gets bigger and bigger. This number doesn't update because we took that away, but that's okay. So I want to show you guys that there is a callback function. It's really, really valuable to know that, because there were times where I wanted to actually console log the state and say, okay, what am I getting? Like, what is this new result here? What happens after my state is updated? Then what do? I need to see what's going on, or I need to do something else, perhaps, right? And so that's really awesome. Basically, every time the state gets updated, you can then respond to that successful state update and maybe display a message to the user, or go and update something else, or change something on the DOM in some way, or maybe, you know, you want to disable a button so that they can't click on things while you are doing something in the background. Whatever it is, you can do that. The second argument of state is a callback function, and I'm pretty sure in the function version of set state that there is also a callback function as well. So yeah, so just something definitely worth noting is that you can do that. Something else that's also important to note, and I'm just going to bring over the documentation really quickly to show this, is that the merging of state is shallow. Okay, so what does that mean? Basically, if we have this here, if we have two things inside of our state, we have the posts for a blog, let's say we have posts, and we have comments. Basically what this means is that if we were to make two separate calls to update state, right? If we were to make a call that went and got the posts from our server, and then a totally separate API call that went and got the comments from our server, and we went and updated state for each individual thing. So when we get the posts, we update the state and have the posts. When we get the comments, we update the state and have the comments, right? So we can do that as two totally separate individual things and not even, you know, really pay attention to the other thing. Like here, we're not setting comments to equal comments as well inside of this post. We're leaving it alone. And basically what happens is that React doesn't touch it. It just leaves it be, because this update, you didn't ask for anything to have to do with that, right? So it doesn't touch those comments or anything like that. Okay, so something else also in the documentation in the last part of this section is that data flows down. React is unidirectional, which means that it flows in one way. So basically, the parent and the children don't actually know if they are stateful or stateless. And they also don't know about the state itself, right? So the state is totally encapsulated within the one controller, given that it is a stateful control, not control. I keep saying controller. The state is encapsulated within that one component, given that it is a class-based component. And no other components know about that state. No other components care about that state. You can, if you want to, if you have components within a parent component, you can, if you want, pass the state down to those children components as props, but otherwise they have no idea about that state in the parent component, and they don't really need to either. So for example here, if we had this formatted date component, right, we could pass down the date from our clock component as the date there and use it here. So basically we'd be passing down the state from our parent component, the clock component. We don't have to do that. And if we didn't do that, the formatted date component would have no idea about that state ever existing. And this is referred to, yes, it's unidirectional, which I already mentioned, but it's referred to as top-down. So things flow down from the parents into the children whenever you decide that they are needed. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe. Leave me a comment down below if you think that I missed anything, or if you think that I could be doing better in these videos. And even if you think maybe a suggestion as to how I could do better in these videos, that would be cool too. All right, so anyway, thanks for watching, and in the next video, we're going to be tackling handling events. All right, guys, see ya.